We'll be sharing a PowerPoint slide talking about the Native American boarding schools and the COVID response. So 1 moment. So we'll be starting with a quote from James Baldwin, who is a Black, queer, internationally renowned essayist, playwright, activist, and public intellectual. He's no longer with us, but his work has powerfully shaped writing, consciousness about what America is and what it always has been, and his definition of education, of what it should be, is to create in a person the ability to look at the world for himself, to make his own decisions, to say to himself, this is Black or this is white, to decide for himself whether there is a God in heaven or not, to ask questions of the universe, and then to live with those questions is the way he achieves his own identity. And that's from his essay, A Talk to Teachers. And so we're going to be discussing the Native American boarding schools and what the intentions of the U.S. In starting those schools. And you'll learn that it had nothing to do with actually educating the children in a way where they could express themselves, learn about their culture, their people, and make decisions on their own. You'll find that this was about assimilation, not education. So one of the first schools started, Native American boarding schools, was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. This was started by Richard Pratt, and this picture to the right is of a student, an Indigenous child who before and after. So you'll see that all of their hair was cut off. All the adornments, the dressings, everything was removed, and they were made to be more white or perceived as more white and to assimilate, to fit into white culture and whiteness. And this is something that was done not to enrich Native children, but to actually control Indigenous populations. So I'm going to go into a video clip where we're going to talk about why Native American boarding schools were started. And these industrial schools, it was not to actually enrich lives. It was not to actually support communities and help Native nations. It was a strategy to plunder. So we'll have a short clip and then I'll discuss it afterwards.
I was adopted by a white missionary couple. I was adopted, immediately placed for adoption.
I was in foster care with one family for 18 years.
My parents loved us, and I understand that, but at the same time, they took the idea that they were saving us from ourselves. They say I should be grateful for the life that I've given, because any child on the reservation would give anything to live as I was living.
They took us away from our mom. They came marching right in and literally took us and thousands of other children from their home.
It's a way to eradicate us. And to go to a nation's children is one of the sure ways to do that.
The U.S. has a long and brutal legacy of attempting to eradicate Native Americans. For centuries, they colonized Native American lands and murdered their populations. They forced them west and pushed them into small, confined patches of land. But Native Americans resisted. The Board of Indian Commissioners report said, instead of dying out under the light and contact of civilization, the Indian population is steadily increasing. And U.S. found a new solution to absorb and assimilate them.
And that video clip, and I'll be showing another video clip in a couple of more slides, is from the Vox documentary, How the U.S. Stole Thousands of Native American Children. And so what you saw in that clip is that it was a strategy. It was for uniformity, not education. It was an assimilation project. And it was a part of ethnic cleansing. The Native American boarding schools were a strategy to plunder. What the United States has found, and many Western nations have found, that when it comes to Black and Indigenous peoples, when it comes to populations that are exploited, that it's much easy to use education to miseducate, actually, and to force groups of people into assimilation than to let them be themselves and let them be who they are. And so this was a part of them stealing more land. This was a part of them taking away the next generation from Indigenous nations. And so the Native children were stripped of their names, languages, customs, and spiritual practices. And so when you know who you are and you have relation with your family and community, and you know about the people before you, it gives you a strong sense of self. And so they were trying to strip that all away to make it easier to control Native children. So next, we're going to have a clip about Richard Henry Pratt. This was a man who was responsible for these horrific genocidal industrial schools. He was the colonel in charge of the Carlisle Industrial School, which is the first one and the one where you'll see the majority of images from it, because he was heavily involved in propaganda. And the purpose of the program of the industrial schools is to kill the Indian and save the man. And so what they wanted to do was to completely dehumanize and break down who they saw as a threat, who they saw as basically people who were in the way of the land that they wanted to steal, the resources that they wanted to steal, and they wanted to control those populations. And so now we're going to go into a clip talking about Richard Henry Pratt and how he was forcing the students into assimilation.
It all started with an experiment, and a man named Richard Henry Pratt. He had in his charge some prisoners of war, and he taught these men how to speak English, how to read and write, and how to do labor. He dressed them in military uniforms, and basically ran an assimilation experiment. And then he took his results to the federal government and said, they're capable of being civilized. So he was able to get this project funded. In 1879, the government funded Pratt's project, the first ever reservation boarding school for Native American children. His motto was to kill the Indian and save the man. What started there at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School was nothing short of genocide disguised as American education. Children were forcibly taken from reservations and placed into the school, hundreds, even thousands of miles away from their families. They were stripped of their traditional clothing, their hair was cut short. They were given new names and forbidden from speaking their native languages. To take our children and to indoctrinate them into Western society, to take away their identity as Indigenous peoples, their tribal identity. I think it's one of the most effective and insidious ways that the U.S. did do harm to Indigenous peoples here, because it targeted our children, our most vulnerable. And they tried to make us ashamed for being Indian, and they tried to make us something other than Indian. There are also accounts of mental, physical, and sexual abuse, of forced manual labor, neglect, starvation, and death.
my great-grandfather went to Carlisle, and nobody in my family ever talked about it. So if you Google Indian boarding schools, the majority of the pictures that you will see will be actually from Carlisle. Created propaganda. He hired a photographer to create those before and after photos to show that his experiment was working. So it was, intentional propaganda.
And it worked. The Carlisle model of education swept the country and led to the creation of over 350 boarding schools to assimilate Native American children.
On the one hand, we have a Navajo refining in the desert. Few of these whites and rebels have ever seen a white man. Yet, through the agencies of the government, they are being rapidly transformed from their state of comparative savagery and barbarism to one of civilization.
In 1900, there were about 20,000 Native American children in these schools. By 1925, that number more than tripled. Families that refused to send their kids to these schools faced consequences like incarceration at Alcatraz or the withholding of food rations. Some parents who did lose their children to these schools even kept outside to be close to them. Many students ran away. Some found ways to hold on to their languages and cultures. Others, though, could no longer communicate with family members. And some never returned home at all. By stripping the children of their Native American identities, the U.S. government had found a way to disconnect them from their lands, and that was part of the U.S. strategy. During the same era in which thousands of children were sent away to boarding schools, a number of U.S. policies infringed on their tribal lands back home. In less than 5 decades, 2/3 of Native American lands had been taken away.
The whole thing was purposeful, and the fact that it has been buried in the history books and not acknowledged is also intentional. And in fact, the same tactics were used in New Zealand, Australia, Canada. All of these countries have acknowledged, apologized, or reconciled in some way, except for the United States.
Over time, the brutality of boarding schools started to surface. And after a 1928 report detailed the horrific conditions at some schools, many began to close. In the 1960s, Indigenous activism rose alongside the civil rights movement. And by the 1970s, that activism forced more schools to shut down. The government handed over control of the remaining boarding schools to tribes to be run in partnership with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. But just as the boarding school era started fading, another assimilation project.
So that was a clip about the Native American boarding schools. And a few things I think is important to discuss about it. First, you'll notice how they kept talking about wanting to make the children something other than Indian, something other than Native, which is what they were. And that they, as you saw, the white man in the clip, he was saying that these children have never seen white people before. And so they were definitely trying to make that the standard, that whiteness, civilization, being civilized was the goal of the program, really to strip the students from their culture, from everything that they knew. Another thing that was important that the video clip discussed was that the policies at home to take away more land. So after they removed the youth, after they, took thousands, tens of thousands of students from their nations, and they removed the future from communities, they began to peck away at what was going on at home. So this was a strategy. This is nothing about trying to teach kids math or trying to educate them certain skills. It had nothing to do with but control and plunder and genocide and ethnic cleansing and stealing from these nations. And that's what the United States has done and continues to do to Native peoples. I also think it's important to point out that the United States has a long history, has always kidnapped non-white children, and some white children too, poor white children, especially people before they became white, like Irish people. But it's really important to note that when we talk about children in cages now, that the United States, not only did they kidnap the children from Native American boarding schools, because when you take a child from their home and the parents can't interact with them, and the parents go to jail if they don't give up the child, that's just kidnapping, honestly. And this is something that was also done to Black children. We know that during chattel slavery, Black children were trafficked, that they were used as property, just as all Black people during chattel slavery were used as property and stolen and taken from their families. We know that even to this day, Black children are sent to juvenile detention facilities. We also know that poor Black parents have their children removed from their households from DFACS. So this is something that happens all the time. So the United States has caused these conditions of poverty in Black and Indigenous communities, and then they go in and take the children. Another thing that it's important to mention is they talked about a phase 2. So the phase 1 was the Native American boarding schools, but the phase 2 was adoption, and this is really important. They use adoption as a way to continue this process, because they know that the boarding schools are controversial. But the thing that the United States does is when they have white supremacy, they have these systems, they change it ever so slightly to have some of the same goals, but to do basically the same thing. So yes, the Native American boarding schools were turned over to the nations, and some were closed down. But then they began the process of allowing white people to adopt and take in, and it's adoption in the sense where it's just kidnapping. Once again, going into communities and just taking away Native children. And even to this day, there is litigation about taking Native children away from their homes and being adopted by white families, where they are separated from their culture and identity. Miseducation is another part of how we exacerbate what has happened to Native nations. So not only did we have the boarding schools and the adoptions and the genocide and the taking the land, the plunder, but we also taught everyone else that it really wasn't that bad. We teach the children that there were some treaties, some of it didn't go well, but in the end, they got along and they came together. I put this picture up of the Pilgrims and Native Americans because this is a very familiar picture. Everyone my age and older saw this type of, I think it's propaganda in their school, in their hallways that, they may have thought, but in the end, the United States and Native Americans got along, and it couldn't be any further from the truth. I even saw a video even a few years ago, I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, of one of the people I knew from college. Their daughter was having a Thanksgiving play, and it had the Pilgrims and the Native Americans and teepees and a lot of other racist things. So we're still teaching kids this right now. Matter of fact, every year we see teachers continue to have these displays during various holidays and months, heritage months for non-white people. We see these racist images come up online on social media. So this is still happening, that we have miseducation going on. So when we talk about U.S. treaties, and we also frame it as Indian removal. Honestly, it was genocide. None of these treaties were kept, and the removal was not consensual. There wasn't serious and good faith negotiations happening. And in Thanksgiving, I discussed Thanksgiving and how it's really framed as a day of unity between the colonists and the Native American, and we still see children's plays and things happen every year. And that is definitely miseducation. Infectious disease, the schools teach the infectious diseases that killed so many Native Americans as a mistake. Well, actually, the colonists knew that these diseases were killing off so many Native Americans. It was making it easier to defeat them and take their land and their resources. And so they would purposely find ways, whether it was a blanket or other objects or just going into their communities, they would find ways to purposely infect people. And honestly, based on how people have been acting during this COVID situation, that is not surprising. This callousness that we have towards other people who are vulnerable is something that's always happened in the United States. And then Christopher Columbus, just celebrated, has an actual federal holiday, and as this explorer and navigator, and he did great things. They changed the tone a little bit, but he's still celebrated. He actually was a failed navigator. He did not find the route that he wanted to find, and he did not discover anything. He opened the door to what would be widespread genocide and terror for Native nations. So that's nothing to celebrate. And so we celebrate Indigenous Peoples Day. The COVID response. One of the reasons why we named this presentation Native American boarding schools and the COVID response is because I see a lot of similar patterns and how that history of boarding schools happened and what was allowed to happen for so long by the United States and what they did, even though, of course, Native nations, let's make it clear, they resisted it every step of the way and fought it every step of the way. I see that some similarities between that and how we're handling education in the school system in COVID right now. We see that the main driving force in having kids go back to school is economic interests, and that we are unprepared, that most school systems that return are unprepared. They're opening, closing, not enough PPE, these really fake plastic barriers that don't even work. The students are not prepared, don't have the devices that they need. And so I have this quote from Chuck Schumer, who is the Senate Minority Leader, who said that if schools don't open, parents, about 1/3 of the workforce, has a child that's below 13 years of age. Who's going to watch the kids? If the schools don't open, it's going to hurt the whole Dutchess County economy and the whole Hudson Valley economy. So that was a comment he was making about a particular district, but it represented what many people felt, that, well, it wasn't the kids need to go back to school because it's the best thing for them. It was, well, if the kids don't go back to school, how are we going to do this? And how are we going to get the cities back up and running? And how are the parents need to go back to their jobs and serving people? So that was a major driving factor. And yes, there are some legitimate concerns to education and how it impacts certain students. But there were so many different ways to approach that and address that even before the pandemic started. But we saw that there were a lot of interesting takes happening to get the kids back into schools, regardless of how much of a threat it was. The school districts were also very unprepared. At the GCPS board meeting in October, teachers, parents, students, and community members reported the following: a lack of electronic devices, teachers with compromised immune systems were forced to work, and the lack of staff and social distancing. So they did not have, GCPS did not have enough substitute teachers before the pandemic, and so it has been quite a nightmare afterwards. Teachers who had compromised immune systems were told that they still need to show up anyway. And one teacher came to the board basically airing out what she has been through and holding the board accountable for not having a protocol put in place for teachers with compromised immune systems who did not want to risk the health of their family. You have to understand that some people have multi-generational households. They have, their parents or great-grandparents, especially minorities, tend to live in family makeups in houses with multi-generation. So it's quite something to just be so callous to the people who are vulnerable to this. And then there was a lack of Chromebooks. Some students didn't have access to internet. These were things that should have been addressed for a county that GCPS has $2 billion a year, and they should have figured out a way to make sure that this was taken care of a long time ago, that students have what they need, because so much of what kids do is online and on devices. So it's really telling that this gets exacerbated once the pandemic happens. I also think it's important to talk about the current resistance of Indigenous peoples. Native Americans are not a people group that used to exist and no longer exists. Native Americans are still here. They're still here, and they're in many, many nations, and they are fighting for their sovereignty, for environmental justice, and for liberation for their nations and all people. Every single thing that Native Americans fight for comes to a great benefit of everyone. And if we would have listened to what they have said about the environment a long time ago, we wouldn't be in the climate catastrophe that we are in now, with all the fires ravaging California and the hurricanes breaking records every year. All of these things were warned about. So they're fighting against racist symbolism. So there's several mascots that depict Native American people as a monolith and as a character. There's a football team in Washington, D.C. I will not be saying that name, and that name has been changed due to their activism. Land and water rights, we know of the Keystone Pipeline and the Dakota Access Pipeline. They've been fighting to stop the oil pipelines there. And because we know once these oil spills happen, and these oil spills happen all the time, they destroy the water, the land, and people get sick, they seep into the ground. So all of these things are to protect themselves and also the environment in general. And so that concludes today's presentation. I would urge you to go to www.gwinnettstop.org for more information, and we appreciate you listening with us tonight.